So to answer the question for why Claude Code is so cracked for GTM, it comes down to code and context. So this video is going to be part 2. Part 1, I'm linking it below. But to summarize the first part of this, right, we in the GTM world have been given the same capabilities that engineers have had. And so now there's a huge unlock when you take the engineering ability of coding and the context that Claude Code allows you to have. And the general premise behind this is almost any form of knowledge work you want to do can be done better by code, right? And this is true of even creative things like writing emails, because even emails are, what are you doing? You have a signal that you need to pull, you need to bridge that problem to what you're offering, and you need to do it with your voice and in a way where you're not pitching them. And this is at its core, right? This is a pipeline. You can view this from the lens of an engineering problem. Once you have your tooling and process in place for custom enrichment, and you've used Claude Code enough to have a really solid context repo, and you're layering skills on top of that to put out your copy, you're not only doing this much easier, you're doing this much better. Right, and this is why a lot of AI first-line writing tools failed, because they couldn't do the first step properly, right? They couldn't get a proper signal. Claude Code helps this process be so much better, and so you don't have to use this as a signal or use this as a signal. And if you've done this yourself, right? I've been in this position for 10 years of how do we get better outbound for the company? You'll know that that's definitely not the most effective way to do it. For an individual human, whether they're an SDR or anyone in the sales org, to go onto LinkedIn, do a Google search on the company, look up the CRM manually, read their website. I used to do this manually, step by step as an SDR, right at a 5-minute timer. That's how things were done on our team. But when you have the capability to run a script that can do this in seconds for thousands of records, you're not going to look back. And that's what we're in the middle of right now. So this is the first half of what I was talking about, right? Why is code so impressive? Then it comes to context. The best way I can explain this is I go back to ChatGPT example, flip open your laptop, you type the problem that you're going through, and you're doing work in your browser, right? You might ask 1 question, 10 questions. When you're done, you're done. Any improvement, anything you've learned in that session, you're not retaining that. You're getting your work done for the session, you're shutting down that browser, and then you're starting basically from scratch. Yes, I know chat has memory, but it doesn't work in that way. Memory in chat works like this. It's like a single sheet of paper. It's a flat memory system that tries to recall everything it knows about you on there. Your work, any personal stuff you're asking about it, your marketing, whatever department you're dealing with, all of that is sitting together on this flat sheet of paper. Whereas with a code base, and maybe this is a better visualization, everything's filtered down by project. So when you say, I want to execute a marketing campaign for sales leaders, there are many folders in here, and within these folders, they're categorized. So there is a file for how you think about sales leaders. There is a skill in there that's recalled automatically on the best way to write your emails. And it's pulling from a separate file that has your best templates for how you want to write. And it's also comparing against another folder that contains all your outbound performance from before, or it's pulling that directly from, let's say, your Instantly API that it's able to call. You can see how that's a very, very different game than trying to recall everything from a flat memory system where it just logs every fact about you that you've told it to remember, and it's limited. And this is why once you get over the technical hump or the challenge of dealing with markdown files and creating skills and looking at things through the lens of a local file system, you'll see that this is a knowledge base that will allow the agent to run on its own and make really, really smart decisions on your behalf. And this is the kind of the idea of compound engineering. You apply it to a GTM perspective. Your first campaign, you'll have to explain everything, right? The first time you open Claude Code, it doesn't know anything about you. Later, you will, once it ingests the context you provided. You're going to add in things like your sales call transcripts. You're going to add things like you're going to allow it to connect to your outbound performance data. You're going to explain your ICP. You're going to explain your sales methodology. And I'll do separate videos on how to get all this context into Claude Code. But on your first campaign, right, you're explaining everything to it. On your second campaign, once it has the context, that's it, right? You don't need to hold hands and then walk it through the process anymore. On your fifth campaign, now it's making suggestions for you that you hadn't even thought of in the first place because it's cross-referencing patterns across your previous work. Another way me to think about this differently in the GTM world is just the UI. We are addicted to workflows, especially on this corner of LinkedIn, right? You've seen a lot of this and you've seen a lot of this, probably too much of both. And the problem with that is a workflow is simply execution. You build it up front. So you say, okay, I want you to take this data from this source. I want you to enrich this information specifically. I want you to run this scraper and get this information from this API. There's something static about workflows in that you have already determined ahead of time the work to be done. And so we build all these fancy diagrams, right? Like the one next to me, and they look pretty on LinkedIn. But in practice, when something goes wrong, or when we want to make an adjustment, we're effectively building it all again from scratch every time we want something to change. And your workflow it's dumb. It doesn't know who you are. It doesn't know what you're trying to accomplish. It's just executing a fixed sequence of steps because you told it to do it. Whereas an agent, on the other hand, is looking at accounts. It's making decisions about enrichment and everything else based on what it already knows because you've done a great job of providing context ahead of time. And so, for example, right, let's say your objective is you want to reach out to marketing leaders at e-commerce companies or something like that, and you build a workflow ahead of time. If there are companies in that list that are very different from each other, the workflow just executes because that's all it knows how to do. If there's an issue, for example, like some of these companies are enterprise companies and some of them are early stage startups, the workflow is a hammer and all it sees are nails. And so it will hammer away. Whereas your agent can actually think through these issues, provided you've given it great context and skills ahead of time. And what it can then do, for example, in this case, is if it's an enterprise, let's say, right, we want to pull 10Ks, we want to read earnings calls, we're going to treat them like an enterprise company. But if they're startups, we're going to look at job postings instead, analyze product launches. This is just a small example, but a workflow is a very, very limiting way to operate. Why do we love them in the first place? Well, they were a huge advantage over what we were used to at the beginning, right? Working with databases and having to manually take things from Zoom info, add to CRM, add to sequencer, having workflows allowed us to get access to APIs and be very effective at using them. So shout out to Clay. This is the next level now, where you can still take advantage of that without relying on a static workflow that will execute regardless. And we have to be clear about what's a workflow, what's an agent. When you go on LinkedIn and right, someone tells you common agent, so I'll send you my agent, and it's just an NADA workflow that calls an LLM at some point. That's not an agent, that's a workflow, because anytime you see steps that are clearly defined, that is a workflow. An agent makes calls on what steps to make depending on the relevant context. A single GTM engineer has insane leverage, like much more powerful than even 12 months ago. And if we think about just the structure of a GTM org in general, the team is kind of built around tools that force us to do manual work, right? Like there are people on the team who are focused on the CRM. There are people on the team who are focused on analytics, on enrichment. And what this does is it slows down the process. Here's an example, right? A team has a new idea. Like if you've worked at any sales marketing team, you know what I'm talking about. The team has an idea. Marketing comes up with it. They say, okay, we want to launch this for that, this campaign for this specific idea. And then let's say the SDRs are told, all right, run with this. They go into Zoom info, upload to CRM, right? I've done this very step before, enrich with LinkedIn based on whatever they see. If they need a specific signal, they may talk to RevOps to help them pull it in. And then it's added to the sequence. This entire process can take 3-4 weeks. I've seen this from the perspective of being an SDR, from working with different go-to-market teams of different sizes. Bigger teams does not mean faster execution. It can often be the other way around. And this can break because, like, let's say things go wrong. Been running for 2 weeks and someone makes the call that, you know what, this is not performing the way we want it to. the process starts all over again. Whereas today, from the start, right? Script runs, prospects are scraped, they're enriched, they're fed to Clay, they're sent back to the CR, they're deduped, they're scored, they're launched. If there's an issue, a GTM engineer can go in there and let's say 2 days later and say they're not happy with the response rates for whatever reason. They can jump in there, tweak what needs to be adjusted, and keep things pushing. The real advantage is just speed of execution, in my view, because you're no longer constrained by what the tools are forcing you to do. Great example of what this can look like in practice, not specifically Claude Code, but just GTM engineering org, or the enabled, highly leveraged GTM engineer is Verso's GTM team. This podcast episode on Lenny's podcast about what this looks like. This was a great listen. But in conclusion, right, this logical workflows, you focus on what the knowledge base allows you to do. To me, this is the most fun. This is year 6 of doing this. This is easily the most fun moment. To illustrate the ChatGPT example, I'm going to record a video tomorrow, kind of split screen, Claude Code on one side, ChatGPT on another. ChatGPT I've been using, right? It has 3 years of context of everything about me. And Claude Code has 45 days. But you'll see side by side what I actually mean by this.